The rain had been falling steadily since morning, turning New York City into a blur of wet pavement, honking cabs, and hurried footsteps. At JFK International Airport, the usual chaos of travelers, rolling suitcases, shouting over announcements, checking phones every 3 seconds, was amplified by the gloom outside. People moved like ghosts under the fluorescent lights, shoulders hunched, eyes tired, minds already somewhere else. Near Gate B12, a man stood slightly apart from the crowd. He wasn't trying to be noticed, but he couldn't help it. Tall, dressed in a charcoal gray overcoat that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, he held himself with a quiet stillness that made others instinctively give him space. He wasn't on his phone like everyone else. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the rain streak down the huge windows. If you didn't know who he was, you might think he was just another businessman waiting for a delayed flight. But if you did know, if you'd ever read a business magazine or seen a tech headline in the last decade, you'd recognize him instantly. He was the founder of Viridian Dynamics, the company that had quietly reshaped how the world communicated, worked, even thought. Billions of dollars, private jets, a name whispered in boardrooms and startup garages alike. Yet here he was, alone, looking more like a man carrying a heavy secret than a titan of industry. A few feet away, tucked between a newsstand and a coffee kiosk, a young woman watched him. She'd been waiting for over an hour, pacing in small circles, checking the departure board again and again, even though she already knew his flight number by heart. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, damp at the ends from the walk through the rain. She wore a simple navy blue coat, slightly too big for her frame, and clutched a manila envelope so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Inside that envelope was something she'd carried for months, something that had kept her up at night, made her cancel plans, rehearse conversations in the mirror that never happened. She wasn't used to doing bold things. In fact, she usually avoided attention like it was contagious. She worked at a public library in Queens, shelving books, helping kids with homework, living in a small apartment with a view of a brick wall and a fire escape that squeaked in the wind. Her life was quiet, predictable, safe. But this was anything but safe. What she was about to do felt like jumping off a cliff without knowing if there was water below. She took a deep breath, the kind that fills your lungs all the way to the bottom. She reminded herself why she was here. Not for money, not for fame, not even for answers, really, though she desperately wanted those too. She was here because of a letter, a single sheet of paper she'd found tucked inside an old photo album after her adoptive mother passed away last winter. The letter was addressed to someone named Elias, signed simply Dad. It spoke of regret, of a choice made out of fear, of a little girl named Lily who was the light we couldn't keep but never stopped loving. At the bottom, in shaky handwriting, were 2 lines. If you ever meet her, tell her we're sorry, and tell her we watched her grow up from afar, every birthday, every school play, every step. She'd spent weeks trying to make sense of it. Who was Elias? Who were we? And who was Lily? Then, through old hospital records, a dusty birth certificate, and a few hesitant calls to a retired social worker, the pieces clicked together. Her birth name wasn't the one on her driver's license, and the couple who'd raised her with so much love, the ones who'd read her bedtime stories and held her hand at the doctor's office, weren't her biological parents. Her real parents had given her up when she was just a few days old. They'd visited her for years, secretly, watching from a distance, sending small gifts on holidays that her adoptive parents never knew the origin of. And then one day they'd stopped, vanished. No explanation. The only clue left was that name, Elias. A quick internet search changed everything. There was only one famous Elias connected to that time, that place, that level of quiet influence. Elias Thorne, the billionaire, the man whose parents had died in a car accident 10 years ago, just months after the last anonymous gift had arrived on her doorstep. Now here he was, in the flesh, looking nothing like the cold, polished figure in magazine photos. He looked human, tired, sad even. She checked her watch. His flight was boarding in 20 minutes. If she didn't do it now, she might never get another chance. Her legs felt like lead as she stepped forward. A security guard near the gate glanced her way, then back at his clipboard. She kept walking. The envelope felt heavier with every step. She passed families hugging goodbye, couples arguing over missed connections, a child crying for ice cream. Normal life moving around her like a river. She stopped 3 feet from him. He didn't notice her at first. He was still staring out the window, lost in thought. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned slowly, eyebrows lifting slightly in surprise. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the shadow of stubble on his jaw. He didn't look angry or annoyed, just curious. She held out the envelope. This is for you." He looked at it, then at her face, searching for something. Recognition, maybe, or a hidden agenda. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and calm. She swallowed. I don't expect you to understand right away. But please, just read it. It's from your father." His expression changed instantly. The calm vanished, replaced by something sharp and startled. "My father?" he repeated, almost too quietly to hear. "He's been gone for 10 years. I know," she said quickly. "But he wrote this before he died. And it's meant for you and for me." He stared at her, really looked at her now as if seeing her for the first time. There was something in her eyes, something familiar, something that tugged at a memory he couldn't quite place. He hesitated, then took the envelope. His fingers brushed hers for a second, and she felt a strange jolt like static electricity. "Thank you," she said, already stepping back. "Wait," he said, reaching out slightly. "What's your name?" But she was already turning away, melting back into the crowd before he could say another word. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She walked fast, then faster, until she was almost running toward the nearest exit. The rain hit her face as she stepped outside, cold and sharp, but she barely felt it. All she could think was, "I did it. I actually did it." Inside the terminal, Elias stood frozen, the envelope in his hand. He turned it over. No return address, just his name written in neat, looping handwriting he hadn't seen in a decade. His father's handwriting. He remembered that handwriting from birthday cards, from notes left on the kitchen table, from the margins of old engineering textbooks his dad used to study late into the night. It was unmistakable, but how? His father had died suddenly. There'd been no time for goodbyes, no final letters, just silence. And who was that woman? She'd said, "For you and for me." What did that mean? He glanced toward the exit she'd disappeared through, but she was gone. Just another face in the sea of travelers. He slipped the envelope into his coat pocket, his mind racing. He had a flight to catch, a 3-hour trip to San Francisco for a board meeting he'd been dreading. But suddenly, nothing else mattered. Not the quarterly reports, not the investor calls, not the endless stream of decisions that usually filled his head. All he could think about was that envelope. He found a quiet corner near a charging station, sat down on a hard plastic chair, and carefully opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, slightly yellowed at the edges. He unfolded it with hands that weren't quite steady. The first line hit him like a punch to the chest. "If you're reading this, you've met Maya." Maya, the woman's name. He hadn't even caught it. He kept reading, his breath catching with every sentence. His father's words were gentle, full of sorrow and love. They spoke of a choice made in desperation, a young couple struggling to make ends meet, facing an unexpected pregnancy while trying to raise their adopted son, him, through a difficult phase. They'd been told they couldn't handle another child, not financially, not emotionally, so they'd made the hardest decision of their lives, to place their newborn daughter with a loving family who could give her everything they couldn't. They'd watched her grow up from a distance, never interfering, never revealing themselves, terrified that contact would confuse her or hurt the family who'd taken her in. But they'd never stopped loving her, never. And then came the part that made his vision blur. "Elias, she's your sister. Your full sister. We never told you because we thought it would be too much, too complicated for you, too painful for her. But if she ever finds this letter, if she ever reaches out to you, please, son, don't shut her out. She's family, and family is all we really have." Elias sat there, the airport noise fading into a dull hum. His chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped a band around it. He blinked hard, but the tears came anyway, hot, sudden, impossible to stop. He covered his face with one hand, shoulders shaking silently. Around him, people hurried past, oblivious. A child laughed. An announcement crackled over the speakers. Life went on. But for Elias, the world had tilted on its axis. He thought of all the times his parents had seen me. Distant, preoccupied, especially in the years after he turned 12. He'd assumed it was work stress or maybe marital strain. He'd never imagined they were carrying this secret. A daughter they'd given away, a sister he never knew existed. And that woman, Maya. She'd grown up not knowing who she really was. She'd carried that same confusion, that same hole in her story, and instead of being angry, instead of demanding money or attention, she'd come to him with nothing but a letter and a quiet plea for understanding. He looked down at the letter again, his father's words swimming before his eyes. At the bottom in smaller script was a postscript. P.S. We named her Lily, but she goes by Maya now. Her adoptive parents gave her that name. We always thought it suited her. Lily, Maya, his sister. The boarding call for his flight came over the loudspeaker. Final call for Viridian Dynamics private charter to San Francisco. He didn't move. He just sat there, the letter clutched in his hand, tears still tracing paths down his cheeks. For the first time in years, maybe ever, he didn't care about schedules, about expectations, about the image he was supposed to uphold. All he cared about was finding her, talking to her, understanding. He stood up slowly, wiped his face with the sleeve of his coat and walked, not toward the gate, but toward the exit. He pulled out his phone and dialed his pilot. "Cancel the flight," he said, his voice rough but firm. "I'm not going." Then he turned and walked back into the terminal, eyes scanning the crowd, searching for a woman in a navy blue coat, hoping against hope that she hadn't left the airport yet. But she was gone. And for the first time in his life, the billionaire felt utterly, completely lost. Not in business, not in strategy, but in the simple human need to connect with someone who shared his blood, his history, his pain. The rain outside kept falling. Inside, Elias Thorne stood alone, holding a piece of paper that had just rewritten his entire life. And for once, all his money, all his power meant nothing. What mattered now was something far simpler, far more fragile, a chance to make things right. The private jet sat idle on the tarmac, engines off, cabin dark except for a single reading light above the main seat. Rain tapped gently against the windows, a soft rhythm that usually calmed him. But not tonight. Tonight, the sound felt like a countdown, each drop echoing the seconds ticking away since he'd last seen her. Since she'd handed him that envelope and disappeared like smoke, he hadn't gone to San Francisco. He'd sent his assistant a terse message. Meeting postponed. Personal emergency. No explanation. None needed. People who worked for him knew better than to ask. But this wasn't business. This was something deeper, something raw and unpolished, something he hadn't felt since he was a boy standing in the hospital hallway, waiting to hear if his parents would survive the crash. Now, alone in the jet, he unfolded the letter again. He'd read it 5 times already, maybe 6. Each time, new details surfaced. The way his father described holding the baby, so small, her fingers wrapped around mine like she knew me. The guilt in every sentence. We thought we were protecting you both. We were wrong. And the quiet pride. She's kind. She works with children. She reads, just like you did. He traced the words with his fingertip as if touching the paper might bring his father back, if only for a moment. But all he got was silence and the crushing weight of 10 years of unknowing. Who was she really? Not just Maya, not just Lily. What did she like? What made her laugh? Did she hate rainy days like he did? Did she drink coffee black or with sugar? These were the questions that haunted him now, not quarterly profits or market share. He pulled out his phone and opened a secure browser. He didn't want his usual team digging. Too many eyes, too much risk of leaks. This was private. Too private. He typed in Maya Chen and Queens Public Library. A few clicks later, he found her. A staff page on the library's website. A small photo, her smiling slightly, eyes warm behind thin glasses, hair pulled back. She looked familiar, not in a way he could explain, but in the curve of her cheek, the set of her shoulders. Like looking in a mirror tilted just slightly off angle. He stared at the photo for a long time. Then he closed the tab. He wouldn't stalk her. He wouldn't send investigators to follow her to work or check her credit history. That wasn't how you meet family. That was how you treated a threat. But he needed to know more, so he did the only thing that felt right. He called the one person who might understand. His aunt, the only living relative who'd known his parents well, answered on the third ring. Her voice was thin with age but sharp as ever. "Elias, it's past 10. Is everything all right?" He took a breath. "Auntie, I need to ask you something. About Mom and Dad." A pause. Then softer. "What is it, dear? Did they ever talk about having another child?" Silence stretched so long he thought the call had dropped. Then a sigh, deep, weary, full of things unsaid. "Oh, Elias," she whispered. "So you found out." His throat tightened. "You knew?" "I suspected. After they came back from that trip to upstate New York when you were 12. They were different. Quiet. Your mother cried a lot but never said why. I asked once. Your father just looked at me and said, 'Some things are better left buried.' I didn't push. But why didn't they tell me?" His voice cracked, surprising even himself. "Because they loved you," she said gently. "They were terrified you'd feel replaced. Or guilty, or that you'd resent them. And they were scared for her, for the girl. They didn't want her life turned upside down by our world. Money, fame, it attracts the wrong kind of attention. They wanted her to have a normal life. A normal life without knowing who she was," he said, bitterness creeping in. "Maybe," his aunt said. "Or maybe they just didn't know how to fix what they'd broken. People make mistakes, Elias, even good people. Especially good people. They carry the weight of them the longest." He leaned back, staring at the ceiling of the jet. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. "She gave me the letter. At the airport. She knew who I was. She didn't ask for anything. That sounds like her," his aunt said softly. "If she's anything like your mother, she's got quiet strength, the kind that doesn't need a spotlight." They talked a while longer about his parents, about regrets, about the strange way life circles back on itself. When he hung up, he felt a little less alone, but no less confused. The next morning, he didn't go to the office. Instead, he drove himself, no driver, no security, to a quiet cafe near the Queen's Library. He parked 2 blocks away and walked, hands in his pockets, hood up against the morning chill. He didn't plan to approach her. He just wanted to see her in her world. To understand. He found a table by the window, ordered black coffee, and waited. At 9:15 a.m., she arrived. She walked briskly, a tote bag slung over one shoulder, a thermos in her hand. She greeted the security guard at the library door with a smile and a nod. Then she disappeared inside. He watched the building for an hour. No grand gestures, no drama. Just a woman going to work, doing her job, living her life, unaware that her entire history had just collided with his. Later that day, back in his penthouse, he sat at his desk with a legal pad. He started writing, not emails, not strategies, but questions. What does she need? What does she want? What would make this right? He realized he didn't know the answer to any of them, so he did something he rarely did. He asked for help. Not from lawyers or PR teams, but from a retired social worker he'd met years ago during a charity event. The woman had spent 40 years helping adoptees reconnect with birth families. He called her, explained the situation in vague terms. A letter, a secret sibling, a need for guidance, and she agreed to meet. They met in a quiet park, far from cameras and headlines. She listened without judgment as he read parts of the letter aloud, his voice unsteady. When he finished, she nodded slowly. "This isn't about money," she said. "It never is with these cases. It's about truth. About belonging. She didn't come to you for a handout. She came because she needed to close a chapter. And maybe open a new one. What do I do?" he asked, sounding more like a lost teenager than a billionaire. "You listen," the woman said simply. "You don't assume. You don't overwhelm. You show up with humility, not power. And you give her space to decide what she wants. This isn't your story alone. It's hers too." Her words stayed with him. That night he sat at his desk again, but this time he wrote a letter of his own. Not a legal document. Not a contract. Just words, honest ones. "Maya, I read your letter, my father's letter, over and over. I don't know what to say that won't sound empty. I'm angry at them for keeping this from me. I'm heartbroken for you for all those years of wondering. And I'm ashamed that I never asked the right questions. I don't expect you to trust me. But if you're willing, I'd like to meet. Not as the founder of Viridian, just as at your brother. No cameras, no lawyers, just coffee, whenever you're ready. He didn't sign it with his full name, just E. Then he called the library, not to speak to her directly. He respected her privacy too much for that, but to ask if they could pass along a sealed envelope to Maya Chen. The librarian on the phone sounded cautious but kind. "I'll make sure she gets it," she said. 2 days passed. No reply. He tried not to check his phone every minute. He went to meetings, signed documents, gave orders, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept replaying the moment at the airport. The way her hand trembled, the quiet courage in her eyes, the way she'd said "your father" like it was both a gift and a burden. On the 3rd day, an email appeared in his personal inbox, a simple address he rarely used. The subject line, "Coffee." His heart jumped. He opened it. Just 3 lines. "There's a place on 34th and Maple, small, quiet. They have good chai. Tomorrow, 4 p.m., don't bring anyone." No name, no signature. But he knew. He replied with one word. Yes. That night, he couldn't sleep. He paced his apartment, rehearsing what he'd say, what he wouldn't say. He almost canceled 3 times. What if she changed her mind? What if he said the wrong thing? What if she hated him for having the life she never knew she was supposed to have? But then he remembered his aunt's words. She's got quiet strength. And he realized he had to trust that, and trust himself to be human, not perfect. The next afternoon he arrived early. He wore a plain sweater, no watch, no designer labels. He sat at a corner table, hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee, watching the door. At exactly 4 p.m. she walked in. She looked nervous. She scanned the room, spotted him, hesitated for just a second, then walked over. "Hi," she said, voice soft. "Hi," he replied, standing up slightly. "Thank you for coming." She sat down across from him. For a long moment neither spoke. The cafe hummed with quiet chatter, the hiss of the espresso machine, the clink of cups. Then she looked at him, really looked at him, and said, "You have his eyes." He blinked. "My father's?" She nodded. "I saw a photo once in the hospital file. He was holding me. You look like him when he smiled." Something inside him cracked open. "I'm sorry," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "For everything. For not knowing. For them not telling us. For you having to carry this alone." She shook her head slightly. "It wasn't all bad. My parents, the ones who raised me, they loved me completely. I had a good life. But there was always this question, like a missing piece, finding that letter. It didn't give me all the answers, but it gave me a direction." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the original letter, carefully folded. "I've been carrying this everywhere, like a compass." She smiled faintly. "I wrote to you because I needed to know if you'd understand, if you'd care." "I do," he said, voice thick. "More than I can say." They talked for hours, about childhoods, his in sprawling houses with tutors and silence, hers in a cozy apartment with board games and bedtime stories, about how both their parents had loved books, hated traffic, cried during old movies, about how neither of them had ever felt quite whole, even when everything else seemed fine. He learned she'd studied literature in college, worked part-time at a bookstore, volunteered at a youth center on weekends. She'd never been on a plane until she tracked him down. She didn't own a car. She loved rainy Sundays and hated celery. He told her about the pressure of building something from nothing, the loneliness of success, the way he'd always felt, like an imposter in his own life, like he was playing a role written by someone else. "You weren't," she said gently. "You were just lost. Like I was." As the sun dipped below the buildings outside, casting golden light through the cafe windows, something shifted between them. Not instantly, not magically, but steadily. Like two rivers finally meeting after flowing parallel for years. Before they left, he asked, "Can I see the photo, the one from the hospital?" She pulled out her phone, opened a folder labeled Family, and showed him a black and white image. A young man, his father, young, tired, radiant, holding a tiny bundle. His mother stood beside him, one hand on his shoulder, the other gently touching the baby's cheek. Elias traced the screen with his finger. "That's you," he whispered. "And that's us," she said softly. "All of us." They stood outside the cafe as the evening cooled. No grand promises, no dramatic declarations, just two people standing on the edge of something new. "I'd like to see you again," he said. She nodded. "Me too." And for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt alone. The weeks that followed felt like walking on new ground, soft, uncertain, but full of promise. They didn't rush. There were no headlines, no social media posts, no staged photos, just quiet meetings in parks, cafes, and once, a long walk along the East River as the city lights flickered to life. They talked about everything and nothing. Favorite books, childhood fears, the strange way grief lingers in small things, a song, a smell, the way rain sounds on a tin roof. He learned she hated the word billionaire, not because she resented his wealth, but because it felt like a wall between them. So he stopped mentioning it. He didn't talk about boardrooms or stock prices. Instead, he told her about the first computer he'd built at 14, how he'd stayed up all night soldering wires, how proud his father had been when it finally booted up. She told him about the time she'd organized a story hour for kids during a blackout, using only a flashlight and her memory to recite "Where the Wild Things Are." They were finding each other, piece by piece, but beneath the warmth, questions still lingered, like shadows in a sunlit room. One afternoon, as they sat on a bench in Central Park watching ducks paddle across the pond, she finally asked the thing she'd been holding back. "Why did they stop visiting me?" Her voice was calm, but her fingers twisted the strap of her bag. "The letters say they watched me grow up, but after I turned 10, nothing, no more gifts, no more notes slipped into my school folder. It just ended." He looked down. He'd been wondering the same thing. I know why." She turned to him, eyes searching. "My parents got sick," he said slowly. Not seriously at first, but it was a lot. My dad had heart issues. Mom was exhausted from caring for him. Around that time, I was going through a rough patch, rebellious, skipping school, getting into trouble. They were stretched thin. I think they felt they couldn't keep up the secret anymore, not without risking someone finding out. And they didn't want to hurt you or me by bringing the past into the present. She was quiet for a long time. A breeze rustled the leaves above them. "So they chose you," she said finally, not accusingly, just stating a fact. "No," he said quickly. "Not chose. They protected what they had. They thought they were doing the right thing. I don't think they saw it as a choice between us. They saw it as damage control." She nodded, but her eyes were distant. "It still hurts, knowing they were out there, watching, loving me from afar, and then one day they just vanished. I spent years thinking maybe I'd done something wrong, that I wasn't good enough to keep." His chest ached. "You were always enough, more than enough. They loved you. They just didn't know how to love you openly." She took a deep breath, let it out slowly. "I believe that. I do. But belief doesn't always fix the ache." He reached over, not to touch her, but just to be near. "I'm sorry you carried that alone." She gave him a small, tired smile. "Now I don't have to." A few days later, she invited him to her apartment. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a simple text. "Want to see where I live? I'll make tea." He almost didn't go. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Her space was hers. He didn't want to intrude, but she insisted. Her building was old, brick-faced, with a creaky elevator and a hallway that smelled faintly of cinnamon and old wood. Her apartment was small, just one bedroom, a kitchenette, a living area filled with bookshelves and mismatched furniture. Photos covered the walls, her with her adoptive parents at the beach, at graduation, at a birthday dinner, smiling, loved. "This is nice," he said, genuinely. "It feels unreal." "It is," she said, boiling water on a stove that looked like it had survived 3 decades. No security guards, no staff, just me and my cat, who's probably hiding under the bed right now. Sure enough, a pair of green eyes peered out from beneath the bed as he sat on the couch. He noticed a framed photo on the shelf. Her as a baby, wrapped in a yellow blanket, held by a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair. "Your mom?" he asked softly. She nodded. "She passed last winter. That's when I found the letter, tucked inside her old photo album like she'd been waiting for the right time to let me find it." He understood then. Her mother hadn't just kept the secret, she'd preserved it, knowing one day her daughter might need it. "She loved you," he said. Both sets of parents did, in their own ways. She handed him a mug of chai, steam curling into the air. "I used to wonder if I was just a mistake, a secret they regretted. But reading my father's words, it didn't feel like regret. It felt like love with no outlet." He sipped the tea. It was sweet, spiced, comforting. "I've been thinking," he said after a pause, "about the graves." She looked up. "My parents?" "Ours," he corrected gently. "I visit them sometimes. Not often, it's hard, but I think maybe we should go together." She didn't answer right away. She stared into her mug as if the answer was floating in the tea leaves. Finally, she whispered, "I've never been. I didn't know where they were buried. I'll show you." They went the following Sunday. A quiet cemetery in Westchester, shaded by tall oaks, birds singing in the distance. He led her to a simple headstone. No grand monument, just 2 names, 2 dates, and the words, "Together in life and in peace." She stood very still, then slowly she knelt. She didn't cry. Not at first. She just placed her hand on the cold stone, as if trying to feel something through it. After a long moment she spoke, so softly he almost missed it. "I wish I could have thanked them for giving me a chance, for loving me even when they couldn't hold me." He knelt beside her. "They knew," he said. "Somehow they knew you turned out okay, that you were kind, that you mattered." She looked at him, tears finally spilling over. "Do you think they'd be proud of us, of this?" He took her hand, really took it, palm to palm, like siblings do in old photos. "I know they would." They stayed there for an hour. They didn't talk much. They just sat in the quiet, letting the wind carry their unspoken words to the sky. After that, something shifted again, not in a dramatic way, but in the way trust deepens when shared silence feels safe. She started calling him E sometimes, the way he'd signed his first letter. He started saving her voicemails, not because he needed to, but because hearing her say, "Hey, it's me," made his day feel lighter. But life wasn't all quiet walks and shared tea. One evening, as he left her apartment, a paparazzo jumped out from behind a parked car, camera flashing. "Is this your secret sister?" the man shouted. "Are you giving her a share of the fortune?" He stepped in front of her, shielding her from the lens. "Leave us alone," he said, voice low but firm. "This isn't a story. It's our lives." The man snapped a few more photos before backing off, grinning like he'd struck gold. Back in his car, he was furious, not at the intrusion, but at himself. He'd been careless. He'd let his guard down, and now she was exposed. He called her right away. "I'm so sorry," he said before she could speak. "I'll handle it. No one will bother you." But she surprised him. "Don't," she said. "Don't sue them. Don't issue statements. Just ignore it. If we act like it's nothing, it'll become nothing." He admired her calm. "You're braver than I am." "No," she said. "I'm just used to being invisible. And honestly, I don't want your world crashing into mine. I like my quiet," he understood, and he respected it. Still, the incident made him realize something. He couldn't keep living in 2 worlds, his public life and this fragile, precious thing they were building. So he made a decision. He called his head of communications. "Cancel all media appearances for the next month. No interviews, no panels. I'm stepping back. Is everything okay? The woman asked, concerned. Better than okay, he said. I'm finally doing something that matters. Meanwhile, Maya returned to her routine, shelving books, helping kids sound out words, organizing reading clubs. But now there was a lightness in her step. Colleagues noticed. You seem happier, one said. She just smiled and said, I found something I didn't know I'd lost. One rainy afternoon, as she sorted donations in the library basement, she came across an old children's book, The Velveteen Rabbit. She opened it absently and a folded piece of paper fell out. Her breath caught. It was another letter, not from her father this time, but from her mother. My dearest Lily, if you're reading this, you've found your way home. Not to a place, but to the truth. We never stopped loving you. Every time I saw you laugh at the park or wave from your school window, my heart broke and healed all at once. You were always my daughter, always. Be kind to your brother. He carries his own wounds. And know this, you were never a secret we hid. You were a love we protected, with all my heart, Mom. Maya sat on the dusty floor, tears streaming down her face, clutching the letter to her chest. This time the ache wasn't sharp, it was soft, like a bruise finally healing. That night she called him. I found another letter, she said, voice trembling. From her. He listened as she read it aloud, his own eyes stinging. When she finished, there was a long silence, then he said, They left us a map, didn't they? Not of roads or cities, but of love. And we're finally learning how to read it. Yes, she whispered. We are. In the days that followed, they began talking about the future, not in grand plans, but in small, honest hopes. She mentioned wanting to start a program at the library for kids in foster care, helping them find stories that reflected their lives. He offered to fund it quietly, through a nonprofit, no name attached. She agreed, but only if he'd help design the reading nook. You're good with details, she said. Remember that computer you built? He laughed. I'll bring the blueprints. They weren't fixing the past. They couldn't. But they were building something new from its pieces, something real, something theirs. And for the first time in their lives, neither of them felt like they were missing a part of themselves. Because now they had each other, not as a billionaire and a librarian, not as secrets or surprises, just as brother and sister, flawed, healing, finally whole. The seasons turned. Summer heat gave way to crisp autumn air, and the city changed its coat. From bright greens to golds and reds, from open windows to steaming cups held in gloved hands. In that time, something steady had grown between them, not loud, not flashy, but deep, like roots spreading under quiet soil. They'd settled into a rhythm. Every other Sunday, he'd show up at the library with 2 paper cups of chai and a bag of pastries from that little bakery she liked. They'd sit in the reading nook they'd built together, soft rugs, bean bags, shelves painted in warm colors, and talk while kids curled up with books nearby. No one knew who he was. To them, he was just Maya's brother, the quiet guy who fixed the wobbly table and always remembered to bring extra cookies. One afternoon, as rain tapped gently on the library skylight, she handed him a folder. I've been thinking, she said, eyes bright with an idea. What if we did more than just this room? He opened it. Inside were sketches, notes, a rough budget. A foundation? He read aloud. Not a big one, she said quickly. Nothing fancy, just a way to help kids like me. Kids who grew up wondering where they came from. We could offer counseling, support groups, help with records, things that don't cost a fortune but mean everything. He looked up at her. You've been planning this. I've been dreaming it, she corrected. But I didn't want to ask you for money. I wanted to ask you to build it with me. He closed the folder slowly. You don't have to ask. You know that, right? Anything you want to do, I'm in. She shook her head. Not like that. Not as the billionaire funding a project, as my brother. Equal partners. You handle the logistics, the legal stuff, the things I don't understand. I'll handle the heart of it, the people, the stories, the trust, he smiled. Deal. They spent the next few weeks meeting in coffee shops, drafting mission statements, choosing a name. They settled on the Open Door Project, because everyone deserves a chance to walk through the door of their own story, no matter how long it's been closed. It wasn't easy. There were forms to file, lawyers to consult, meetings with social workers who needed convincing that this wasn't just another rich person's vanity project. But every time doubt crept in, They reminded each other why they were doing it. "This isn't about fixing the past," she said one evening, as they pored over spreadsheets in her apartment. "It's about making sure other kids don't have to spend years feeling lost. And it's not about charity," he added. "It's about dignity. About saying your story matters, even the messy parts." They launched quietly with no press, no gala. Just a small office above a bookstore, 2 part-time staff, and a hotline that rang more often than they expected. The first call came from a teenager in Ohio, voice shaking. "I just found out I was adopted. I don't know who I am." Maya stayed on the line for an hour, just listening. Afterward, she sat in silence for a long time. He didn't say anything. He just made tea and sat beside her. "They're scared," she finally said. "Just like I was. But now they have someone to call," he replied. "Because of you," she looked at him, eyes glistening. "Because of us." As the project grew, so did their bond. They started celebrating small things. Birthdays, holidays, even the anniversary of the day they met at the airport. The first year they went back to JFK not to fly anywhere, but just to stand near Gate B12 and laugh about how nervous they'd both been. "I thought you were going to arrest me," she admitted, sipping hot chocolate from a paper cup. "I thought you were a spy," he said, grinning. "Or worse, a journalist." They'd come a long way, but not everything was smooth. One evening, after a long day at the foundation, she showed up at his apartment unannounced. She looked exhausted, her coat damp from the rain, eyes red-rimmed. He let her in without a word, handed her a towel, made tea. "I saw a photo today," she said after a while, "from the adoption agency. It was me, 3 days old. And my parents. They were there, holding me, smiling, like any new parents would." He waited. "And I just broke down," she whispered, "because I realized I never got to say goodbye. I never got to thank them. I never got to tell them I turned out okay." He sat beside her on the couch. "You don't need to say it out loud for them to know." "But I want to," she said, voice cracking. "I want them to see this, the foundation, you, me, us. I want them to know their choice didn't break me. It led me here." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook, his father's old journal, which he'd found in a box of belongings years ago but never read. "I found something too," he said. "Last week. I finally opened it." He flipped to a page near the end. The handwriting was shaky, dated just weeks before the accident. "Today I saw her at the park. She was chasing bubbles, laughing like the world was made of joy. I wanted to run to her, scoop her up, tell her I'm her dad. But I didn't, because her real mom, the one raising her, was there watching with tears in her eyes. And I knew she's loved. She's safe. That's enough. Maybe one day she'll understand. Maybe she'll hate us. But if she ever meets Elias, tell him to be kind to her. Tell him she's his sister in every way that matters." Maya read it twice, then pressed the page to her chest. "They knew," she whispered. "They knew we'd find each other. They believed in us," he said softly, "even when they couldn't be here." That night they didn't talk about logistics or plans. They just sat together in the quiet, letting the weight of their parents' love settle around them like a blanket. A few weeks later, they visited the cemetery again, this time with a small wooden box. Inside were printed photos. Maya reading to children at the library, the two of them laughing at a cafe. The first open door project brochure. They placed the box at the base of the headstone. "We're doing okay," she said, voice steady now. "Better than okay." He put his arm around her shoulders. They'd be proud. As they walked back to the car, she said, "You know, I used to think family was something you were born into. But now I think it's something you choose. And rebuild. And protect," he nodded. "And sometimes it finds you in the most unexpected places, like an airport in the rain." She smiled. "Best wrong turn I ever took." Their work continued. The foundation helped more people every month, reuniting siblings, supporting adoptees through identity crises, even helping birth parents write letters they'd been too afraid to send. They never took credit. The stories belonged to the people who lived them. But one day a letter arrived addressed to both of them. It was from a woman in Oregon who'd used their services to reconnect with her biological son after 30 years. She wrote, "You gave us back what we thought was lost forever, not just each other, but the chance to say I'm sorry and I love you in the same breath. Thank you for turning pain into purpose." Maya taped the letter to the wall in their office. "This," she said, "is why we do it." He looked at her, really looked, and saw not just his sister but a force of quiet courage. She'd taken her own wound and turned it into a bridge for others. That was the kind of strength money could never buy. One evening, as they closed up the office, she turned to him. "Do you ever wonder what our life would have been like if they'd told us?" He thought about it. "Maybe, but I don't want to live in what if. I want to live in what is, and what is pretty good," she laughed. "Yeah, it really is." They walked out into the cool night air, the city humming around them. No bodyguards, no cameras. Just two people who'd found each other against all odds, walking side by side. No longer strangers. No longer secrets, just family. And in that ordinary moment, under the glow of streetlights and a sky full of stars, they were exactly where they were meant to be. Time has a way of smoothing sharp edges. What once felt like a wound, raw, confusing, heavy, slowly became part of the story, not the whole of it. 2 years had passed since that rainy day at the airport, and life had settled into something that felt less like a miracle and more like home. They didn't live together. They didn't share bank accounts or last names in any legal sense. But they shared Sunday dinners, inside jokes, quiet walks through the park when the world got too loud. They'd built something real, not out of obligation or guilt, but out of choice day after day. The Open Door project had grown, but not in the way people expected. There were no billboards, no viral campaigns, just steady, quiet work. They'd helped over 200 people reconnect, with siblings, parents, pieces of themselves they'd thought were lost forever. And every success story was treated like a secret gift, never shared without permission, never used for publicity. One crisp November evening, they met at their favorite spot, a small Italian restaurant tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop. The kind of place with checkered tablecloths, garlic bread that arrived before you even ordered, and waiters who remembered your usual. He was already there when she walked in, wearing a sweater she'd once teased him for buying. Too soft for a tech guy, she'd said. Now it was his favorite. "You're late," he said, but he was smiling. "Traffic," she replied, hanging up her coat. "And I stopped by the library." Mrs. Alvarez finally found her birth mother's name in an old church record. She cried for 10 minutes, then hugged me like I'd handed her the moon. He poured her a glass of red wine, her favorite, the one with the cherry label. "You did hand her the moon." She shook her head. "We did. You funded the research grant." I just held her hand. "That's the part that matters," he said. They ordered pasta. Talked about nothing important. The new cat she'd adopted, a grumpy tabby named Poe. The way his assistant kept trying to get him to wear a tie to meetings. I told her I'm not running for office. The fact that neither of them had been on a date in over a year and were perfectly fine with it. But as the meal wound down and the restaurant emptied, the conversation turned quieter, deeper. "Do you ever miss them?" she asked suddenly, stirring her wine with a fork. He knew who she meant. "Every day, but not in the same way I used to. Before it was like a hole, now it's more like a presence. Like they're still part of the room even when they're not here." She nodded. "I dream about them sometimes. Not sad dreams. Just ordinary ones. My mom baking cookies. My dad reading the paper. Like we were always a family even when we weren't together." "Maybe," he said softly. "We were, just in a different shape." She looked at him, eyes warm. "You've changed, you know. Good change. The best kind. You used to carry the world like it was your job to hold it up. Now you just live in it," he laughed quietly. "Turns out having a sister who calls you out for overthinking helps." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the clink of dishes from the kitchen, the hum of the city outside. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. "I wrote something," she said, handing it to him. "Not a letter from the past this time. One for the future." He opened it. Inside was a single page, handwritten in her neat script. "To whoever finds this, family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the person who shows up when you're lost, who listens without fixing, who remembers your favorite tea, who stands beside you at a grave and says they'd be proud. If you're reading this, know this, you are not alone. And it's never too late to find your people." Why, he looked up, surprised. "What's this for?" "I'm putting copies in the welcome packets at the foundation," she said. "For the kids, the adults, the ones just starting their search. A reminder that the end of the story isn't written yet." He folded the note carefully and put it in his pocket. "I'll keep one too." Later, as they walked out into the cool night air, she stopped under a street lamp, breath visible in the cold. "Remember that first coffee? When we barely spoke for 10 minutes. How could I forget? You looked like you were about to bolt out the door. And you looked like you'd never had a real conversation in your life." He laughed. "Probably true." She turned to him, serious now. "I was so scared you'd think I was after your money. Or that you'd shut me out. But you didn't, you listened." "I had to," he said, "because you were holding the one thing I didn't know I was missing." They walked the rest of the way to her subway stop in silence, shoulders almost touching. At the entrance, she hugged him, quick, warm, familiar. "See you Sunday?" she asked. "Wouldn't miss it." As he watched her disappear down the stairs, he felt something settle inside him, a quiet certainty he hadn't known before. He wasn't just a founder, a CEO, a name in the news. He was a brother. And that meant more than any title ever could. The next weekend, they gathered at the cemetery again, not for grief, but for celebration. It was the anniversary of their parents' passing, but also the one-year mark of the Open Door Project's first official reunion. They brought flowers, photos, and a small cake from the bakery down the street. They didn't speak much, just stood together, hands in pockets, watching the leaves fall around the headstone. After a while, she said, "I think they'd like what we've built." "I know they would," he replied. On the drive back, she dozed off in the passenger seat, head against the window. He turned the radio low, drove slowly, and let the quiet fill the car. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to be anywhere else, doing anything else. This simple, ordinary moment was enough. Life went on. The foundation expanded to a second location. She started writing a book, not a memoir, but a guide for adoptees navigating identity, filled with real stories, names changed, of course, and gentle advice. He read every draft, made terrible suggestions about chapter titles. How about Lost and Found, a sibling's guide to not being weird? Aden cheered when the publisher said yes. He in turn stepped back from day-to-day operations at his company, handing leadership to a trusted team. He still owned it, still advised, but he no longer let it define him. "I spent 20 years building a legacy," he told her once. "Now I want to live one." They celebrated small victories. A teenager finding their birth sibling. A grandmother reuniting with the daughter she'd given up during wartime. A man finally learning his true name after decades of paperwork and dead ends. Each story reminded them why they'd started this journey. One spring afternoon, as they sat on a bench in the library garden, now officially named the Open Door Garden thanks to a quiet donation, they watched a group of kids plant sunflowers.